Leo Harrington didn't buy land to make friends. He didn't build his home to be admired, cataloged, or kept in any neat suburban registry. He did it because he wanted something that couldn't be taken from him. Not easily, anyway. On the western edge of a dusty Nevada district where new construction flirted with the desert and land disputes were about as common as car washes, Leo found a parcel that had gone untouched for decades. Off the county road by a few unpaved turns, the soil was cracked and sun-hardened, and the weeds fought every machine that came near. He saw value in that kind of resistance. The lot had no HOA affiliation. He made sure of that. It was clean, freestanding, its status locked in the county archives. He had it surveyed 3 times, filed the deeds himself, double-checked jurisdictional boundaries, and, because he didn't trust paper alone, he made friends with the head clerk at the recorder's office and bought her lunch every other week for a year. The house came later and not fast. Leo wasn't in a rush. He didn't buy prefab kits or call the trendy architecture firms the younger developers used. He brought in a few old hands from his freight company, poured his own foundation, and used leftover steel from an abandoned storage project he once salvaged out in Texas. The frame went up slow but solid, and once it stood, he reinforced the entire southern wall with angled concrete because, as he told his brother, if someone's coming, they're not getting through that side. He wired every inch with commercial grade, security, quiet cameras with long retention storage, a mesh Wi-Fi loop that worked even if the main router failed, and solar backups for every door lock. Not paranoid, prepared. For the first year, Leo mostly kept to himself. He'd drive to nearby towns for groceries, sometimes grab a beer at a bar no one under 40 stepped foot in, and keep his head down. People knew him as the guy with the trucks, the one who owned a modest shipping business, worked quiet, paid in full. He didn't hang American flags, but he didn't let anyone else's touch his fence either. Most of the other homes in the area were newer, built after the tech spillover from California started driving folks east. With them came housing councils, infrastructure proposals, and eventually the dreaded improvement committees, the sort that began with flower beds and ended with mandatory dues. Leo had no patience for that brand of bureaucracy. He made it clear from the start. He wasn't part of their system. He didn't attend the meetings, ignored the optional surveys slipped under his windshield wipers, and when he got a pamphlet inviting him to vote on a new neighborhood entry gate, he used it to wrap the leftover ribs he gave to his dog. He wasn't rude, just firm, but firmness had its cost. Over time, the friendly waves from newcomers became nods, then became nothing at all. A few neighbors stopped trying to include him altogether. One woman, Miranda Sloan, a heavy-set, sharply dressed former paralegal who had somehow declared herself vice president of the local homeowners' council, took it personally. Leo didn't think much of her. She liked to talk loud in public, post rants online about community values, and once called the county over a pile of scrap Leo hadn't had time to move. It didn't amount to anything, but it told him all he needed to know. She was the type to stir trouble just to see who would flinch, but for the most part, peace held. Leo finished his house, expanded the side lot with a reinforced parking pad for his rigs, and planted desert grass that didn't need watering. Life was good, predictable. Until he left town. It was supposed to be a 4-day trip. One of his logistics partners in Utah had run into trouble with a client's customs filings, and Leo had driven out himself to help smooth things over. He took his usual route, didn't tell many people he was going, and left the house locked up, cameras on, alarms set, nothing left exposed except dust on the tires. When he returned, late in the evening, the first thing he noticed wasn't the silence or the sunset. It was the churned earth at the edge of his property. The road leading to his loading bay, an unpaved service path he'd graded himself, was gone, replaced by fresh tire tracks that cut a diagonal trench through his cactus bed and led all the way to the southern slope of his yard. His boots crunched into displaced gravel as he stepped out of his truck, and his stomach sank. The tracks weren't from anything small. No SUV or contractor pickup left those grooves. These were wide, shallow indentations, gouged by steel and weight. He followed them on foot, flashlight cutting through the dusk. They led straight up to his retaining wall where a massive industrial backhoe now sat idle. It was half-parked on his lot, the bucket resting in what used to be a low garden, its treads covered in dry soil and broken irrigation tubing. The cabin door hung open. Someone had used it recently and left in a hurry. Leo circled the machine in silence. There was no tarp, no signage, no permit nailed to the engine housing. Just the machine, like it had dropped out of the sky. He bent down and traced the tread lines with his fingers. The soil was still soft. Maybe 24 hours old, maybe less. He looked up toward the neighboring lots and saw it then. The newly poured strip of concrete extending from the rear of Miranda Sloane's property, arcing toward his land, merging with the machine's trail like some arterial vein. For a moment, he said nothing. Just stared. Then he checked his cameras. The feed was dead. Not erased. Cut. He followed the wiring and found a clean snip about 50 yards from the house. Whoever had done it knew exactly where the blind spot started. He stood there in the half-light, gripping the wire with one hand and the backhoe's railing with the other, feeling the heat rise up through his spine. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't kids playing with heavy machinery. This was planned, calculated, deliberate. And if someone thought Leo Harrington was the kind of man to come home and quietly file a complaint, they had just made a very big mistake. Leo didn't touch the machine that night. He didn't try to move it, didn't call the number scratched into its rusted control panel, didn't even take pictures. Instead, he walked back into his house, boot soles scraping the concrete floor, dropped his keys onto the counter and poured himself a glass of water. He stood in the kitchen in silence, staring out through the narrow horizontal window that faced the back of the lot. In the moonlight, he could see the top of the backhoe's arm peeking over the rise in the earth like the fin of something prehistoric. He let the house sit dark for hours. He didn't even bother turning on the lights. Around 2 in the morning, he went to the breaker panel, checked the auxiliary line that powered the camera array, and found the surge had tripped it clean. Unusual, but not impossible. Still, it bothered him. Whoever did this knew where to cut, and they knew what tools not to leave behind. He slept with his boots on, one hand resting near the revolver he kept in the drawer by the bed, not because he expected anyone to come back that night, but because it was the only way he'd be able to close his eyes at all. The next morning, he drove into town and went straight to the sheriff's substation. It was a tan-bricked, boxy building that shared space with the utility office. Leo waited 15 minutes before anyone came to the front desk, and when they did, it was a woman in her early 30s who looked bored to death and slightly hungover. He explained the situation calmly, clearly, in plain language. Someone brought industrial equipment onto his private property while he was away, tore up a significant portion of his land, laid gravel through it, and connected a new concrete segment from a neighboring lot, without any permission, permits, or notice. He asked that a deputy come out to file a report for trespassing and property damage. The woman nodded, typed something half-heartedly into her computer, and eventually told him, without even making eye contact, that it might be a civil issue, and maybe something to sort with the community board. Leo leaned forward and asked her, as directly as he could without raising his voice, whether she understood what criminal trespass meant under state statute. She blinked, then shrugged. She said she could send someone out when they were available. Maybe later in the week. Leo didn't wait. He drove back to the lot and spent the rest of the day walking every inch of disturbed ground. The backhoe was still there, untouched. He marked the tread path with spray paint, flagged the new gravel border with rebar and tape, and started logging timestamps and measurements on a legal pad. This wasn't paranoia, it was insurance. When he was done, he went inside and drafted a letter to the property board's lawyer, copied his own legal counsel, and sent certified notifications to both the property registrar and building code enforcement office. Then he did something else, something simple. He walked next door. Miranda Sloane's house was a 2-story box with tastefully overpriced window trims and a solar panel display that faced the wrong direction. She had a perfectly paved rear driveway, freshly poured, and a wooden gate that now stood wide open, revealing the extension that bled straight into Leo's property like an infection. As he approached, she stepped out from her back deck, holding a mug with both hands like some politician on a campaign lawn. "Well, hello there, Leo," she said, with a tone that suggested a secret joke only she found funny. Leo didn't smile. "That your machine?" he asked, gesturing with his thumb behind him. Miranda sipped. "I don't own it, no, but it's on loan for some necessary upgrades. Emergency access. The board approved it." Leo raised an eyebrow. "Which board?" She laughed, a sharp, dry sound. "Oh, come on. You know exactly which board." Leo kept his eyes locked on hers. "This land's not in your jurisdiction. Never has been." Miranda tilted her head, the smile tightening. "That's what we're in the process of clarifying. There's been some inconsistencies in the older filings. Some maps still show it as a shared utility corridor." "Bullshit," Leo said plainly. "I'd prefer you not use that kind of language in my presence." "I'd prefer you didn't pave over my damn cactus beds." She took another sip. "Look, I understand this is stressful for you. It's a big change. But we're working toward a more unified infrastructure for the area. Connectivity, continuity, shared access for emergency vehicles. You've got trucks. You get it." Leo shook his head slowly. "Let me be very clear, Miranda. If that machine is still on my land in 48 hours, I'll move it myself. However I see fit." She raised her eyebrows in mock concern. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact." Her expression shifted then, something subtle behind the eyes. Not fear, not defiance. Something worse, confidence. "I'd advise against any unilateral action. This is all under review. You wouldn't want to complicate things for yourself or your business." Leo stepped back, stared at the concrete, then back at her. "You've been warned," he said, then turned and walked away. 2 hours later, a notice appeared taped to his front gate. "Unauthorized interference with public infrastructure may result in penalties or prosecution." No letterhead, no signature. Just a printed sheet and a red stamp that said, "Community Oversight Directive." That night he reviewed every line of the title paperwork again. There was no ambiguity, no easement, no shared zone. He had his survey maps, date-stamped and certified. He had GPS records, and more importantly, he had his boundary lines flagged in the state registry. Whoever was feeding her that shared corridor crap was either lying or betting on the idea that Leo wouldn't be able to respond fast enough. He wasn't going to prove them right. So, the next morning, Leo made a decision. A clear, deliberate one. He walked into his garage, fired up the ignition on his secondary skid-steer loader, and drove it slowly around the back, across the gravel, up the small incline, and stopped beside the backhoe. Then he climbed into the larger machine, jiggled the ignition, and found the key still sitting under the seat. He turned it, felt the rumble of the engine kick in, and lowered the stabilizers with a practiced hand. Then, calmly, purposefully, he guided the backhoe off the gravel strip, down the incline, and straight through the center of the shared property line, dragging the bucket as he went. He didn't speed. He didn't smash things needlessly. But he didn't avoid anything either. Flower beds, patio pavers, a pair of decorative lantern posts. All of it scraped, churned, and pushed aside as he approached Miranda Sloane's house from the rear. By the time he reached the deck, she was already screaming through her window. The bucket paused just below her sliding glass door. Leo sat there for a second, watching her flail her arms in her living room. Then, slowly, the bucket rose. He didn't break the whole wall. Just enough to drive the point home. Literally. A clean swipe through the lower frame. The tempered glass shattered inward with a satisfying crack. Pieces rained across her rug. The bucket rested inside her living room like a mechanical fist. Leo shut the engine off, climbed down, walked to the edge of the deck, looked through the hole. Miranda was frozen in place, mouth open, hands still midair. Leo said just one thing: "Move it yourself next time." Then he walked back home. Leo didn't wait around to see who showed up first, her lawyer, the sheriff, or the press. He knew someone would come, and when they did, he intended to be ready. But he wasn't going to pace the floor like some nervous suspect. Instead, he got up early the next morning, brewed coffee stronger than it needed to be, and went back to the yard with his measuring tape, survey maps, and a roll of marking flags. His goal wasn't revenge, it was precision. He restaked every boundary point with GPS validation, used metal pins for permanence, and logged everything with photo backups. The whole time, he kept the backhoe parked exactly where it had stopped. Bucket still embedded in Miranda Sloane's living room like an anchor dropped into enemy territory. It wasn't moving until someone gave him a lawful reason to move it. By 10:40 a.m., the knock came. It wasn't loud, wasn't hesitant. It was mechanical, official, the kind of knock that comes from someone trained to project authority without raising their voice. When Leo opened the door, he found two deputies standing there, one older and serious, the other younger and slightly uncomfortable, like this wasn't the call he wanted to be on that day. The senior officer introduced himself as Sergeant Dorman and asked if they could come in. Leo stepped aside without a word. He didn't offer them coffee, didn't sit, just stood with his arms crossed as they explained the reason for their visit. They'd received a formal complaint regarding property damage and unauthorized operation of heavy machinery. Specifically, that Leo had driven a backhoe into a residential dwelling and had caused structural harm to a home under protection of the Community Zoning Board. Miranda, they said, was alleging not just vandalism, but criminal intimidation. There were also suggestions that Leo had violated local safety ordinances by using unlicensed equipment in a residential area without a permit. Leo listened in silence, then walked over to the dining table and dropped a folder in front of them. Inside were full title documents to his land, official boundary maps stamped by a licensed surveyor, 2 copies of prior complaints filed against unauthorized intrusion, and a formal cease and desist letter addressed to the community board, dated, and signed the day before the incident. He also included time-stamped photos of the initial encroachment, the backhoe's unauthorized placement on his lot, and the removal of soil and plant life from his property without his consent. Dorman flipped through the documents slowly. The younger deputy didn't touch a thing. He was too busy scanning the room, probably hoping to avoid eye contact. When the sergeant looked back up, his tone had shifted just slightly. More cautious, less accusatory. He asked Leo whether he intended to press charges for trespass or destruction of landscape. Leo said nothing at first, then nodded once. Yes, he did. It wasn't an arrest visit. It was an information sweep. The county had to respond to the optics. Property destruction was one thing, but the idea of a man using a backhoe to send a message across lot lines made people nervous. Leo knew that, but he also knew the deputies had no standing orders to detain him. They were there to feel him out, see if he'd fold under pressure, apologize, maybe make a deal. He gave them nothing. When they left, he locked the door behind them and went to the garage. Over the next 48 hours, the pressure increased. First came the legal summons. Miranda Sloane had filed for an emergency restraining order, citing threats, destruction of private property, and emotional trauma. The language in the document read like something out of a dramatized memoir. References to emerging from bed to the sight of steel and shattered glass, claims of feeling hunted in her own home. It was clearly designed to stir sympathy, not establish facts. Her lawyer, a smug, overfed man named Brennison, attached a motion to the order requesting immediate civil relief, and demanded Leo be barred from using any machinery larger than a lawnmower on his property until further notice. Then came the inspectors. 2 of them, city code enforcement. They arrived in a white truck with stenciled lettering and walked the perimeter of his land like it belonged to them, taking notes on a digital tablet and making noises about non-compliant grading and potential setbacks violations. One of them pointed at the flatbed trailer Leo kept beside his shop and said it might require a special use permit now, due to new regulations regarding storage on the visible surfaces. Leo asked for their business cards. Neither had one. He told them to leave until they could return with a formal warrant or inspection order. They left, but they'd be back. And still, the backhoe remained. It wasn't a statement now. It was a flag, a boundary marker. No one moved it. No one approached it. It sat like an accusation embedded in concrete. On the 4th day, Leo met with his attorney. The man's name was Cal Reimer, former assistant DA from a larger district, retired early after a bitter divorce and a bad investment, but sharp, fast, and deeply vindictive when he sensed a misuse of power. Leo laid out the timeline, the documents, the photos, the police visit, the order, and the code enforcement sweep. Cal absorbed it like a sponge in bourbon. When Leo was done, Cal leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "This isn't about a driveway," he said. "It's a land grab. Plain and simple. Someone's trying to funnel you into a corner where the only options are sell, settle, or get sued until you go broke. And they're doing it under the umbrella of community development, which makes it look like a policy issue instead of what it is, a hit job." Leo didn't blink. "What's my move?" "We go loud. We file an injunction. We get a state-level property assessor out here to verify your boundaries under recent statute. We pull every permit issued by that woman's little committee for the past 18 months, and we find out who signed off on that slab of concrete. We force them into court, make them testify, and when they start pointing fingers, we follow the trail. I guarantee you someone's making money off these upgrades. You don't pour concrete into a cactus bed for fun." They filed the paperwork that afternoon. Cal moved fast. The injunction was accepted for preliminary review the next morning. And just like that, the tide started to shift. But the retaliation didn't stop. That weekend, Leo's work yard, located 15 miles out near the freeway, was vandalized. Locks smashed, gate chain cut, one of his trailers overturned. No theft. Just damage. Message-sending damage. His night crew found it just before the morning shift arrived. Leo filed a report, but when the deputies arrived, they looked tired before they even got out of the car. One of them, a new face, asked Leo if he had any enemies. Leo didn't answer. 2 days later, he received a letter from his insurance provider stating that due to ongoing legal disputes and unresolved property claims, certain aspects of his coverage were being temporarily suspended pending review. That included structural coverage, contents protection, and, most significantly, commercial machinery liability. If someone got hurt on his land, he was exposed. Fully. Leo understood what was happening now. This wasn't a disagreement. It was siege warfare. Squeeze the paperwork, cut the protections, erode the business. Create a problem big enough that the man either bows or breaks. But Leo wasn't bending, and he sure as hell wasn't breaking. He called Cal again. "You ready to get dirty?" Cal laughed. "You have no idea." By the end of the week, they had uncovered the names of 3 subcontractors used in the concrete job behind Miranda's property. 2 were registered out of state, and 1 had a revoked contractor license due to fraud. Cal filed subpoenas for communications between the board and the contracting firm. Meanwhile, Leo sent certified letters to all adjoining property owners with formal notice of boundary reaffirmation and a record of pending litigation. He wasn't just playing defense anymore. He was making it expensive to mess with him. And still, no one dared move the backhoe. It sat in her living room like a silent witness, and Leo made sure it stayed there. Until a judge said otherwise, it wasn't going anywhere. He hadn't just drawn a line, he'd etched it in steel. The air had changed. Not literally. It was still the same dry Nevada heat, the same wind that carried sand like whispers across pavement, but around Leo's property, the tension had thickened, like humidity before a storm. Conversations that used to be casual now stopped when he approached. Eyes that once glanced up now turned away. Trucks slowed as they passed his lot, even when there was no one outside to see them. He wasn't just the guy with the house that didn't want to join the club anymore. He was the guy who put a backhoe through a woman's living room and refused to say sorry. And more importantly, he was the one fighting back publicly, with documents and deadlines and an attorney who didn't blink when things got ugly. That kind of defiance made people nervous, not because they thought it was wrong, but because they quietly wished they'd had the guts to do the same. It was during this shift in tone, this lull between legal firestorms, that Cal got a call from a source in the assessor's office. A clerk, not someone in uniform or high-ranking, but one of those rare people who still believed systems should work the way they were written. She told him there was something off in the parcel archive. The property line maps had been digitally consolidated as part of a zoning update 6 months prior. Normally, this was a routine process where minor lot adjustments were layered into the GIS database for alignment. But in Leo's case, something had gone wrong, or been done wrong. His original plat map had been overlaid with a draft configuration that suggested a shared access corridor ran along the southern 30 feet of his land. That corridor, when followed across a grid, aligned perfectly with the concrete stretch built by Miranda's crew. When Cal asked who signed off on the overlay, the file came up blank. No date stamp, no initials. Just a silent entry that adjusted the virtual footprint of Leo's land without his consent and without notice. Worse yet, when Cal requested the metadata logs, he was told the access logs had been purged as part of a storage cleanup. Someone had erased the trail. It wasn't confirmation of fraud, but it was damn close. The implications were enormous. If a zoning overlay could be quietly inserted into the database and used to justify construction on private land, then Leo wasn't just dealing with a neighbor and her petty council games. He was dealing with someone inside the system, someone with access to official records and the audacity to modify them. And whoever it was, they weren't acting alone. Even Miranda, loud and self-important as she was, didn't seem like the mastermind type. She was a tool. Someone else had handed her the blueprints and told her to run with them. Leo didn't say much when Cal laid this out. He just nodded slowly, absorbing each piece like a mechanic inspecting damage under a hood. One by one, they reviewed every permit tied to the rear easement construction. The contractors were ghosts. Their listed addresses led to mailbox services. Their licensing numbers were expired or duplicated. And when Cal dug deeper, cross-referencing the payment records submitted by the board, they found something strange. The check used to pay the concrete firm had been issued from a development company that wasn't registered in the state, a limited liability shell based in Wyoming. Cal looked at Leo and said it out loud. They're prepping the land for acquisition. Leo leaned back in his chair, jaw tight. He knew what that meant. Not just a grab for his yard, not just paving a shortcut to someone's back gate. They were preparing to rezone the area, consolidate lots, and flip it to a developer with infrastructure already half laid and opposition quietly neutralized. And his land was the linchpin. Without his strip, the grid didn't connect. His refusal to sell or join their schemes had stopped the whole thing cold, and now they were playing dirty to break the logjam. He didn't care about the development plan. He didn't care if they wanted to turn the whole neighborhood into polished duplexes and fake dog parks. What he cared about was the principle. They had tried to take something that didn't belong to them, erase him from the equation, and do it through paperwork so dry and technical that the average man wouldn't even know how to object. It was theft by mouse click, and it had almost worked. The next morning, Leo authorized Cal to move forward with the next phase. They filed a formal challenge to the zoning overlay at the county level, demanded the reinstatement of the original land plats, and submitted a notice of intent to sue for fraudulent administrative action. Within 48 hours, Cal received a thinly veiled warning from a senior clerk at the county planning office. "You're making some people uncomfortable. I hope your client knows what kind of waves he's creating." Leo read that email twice, then once more. Then he printed it out, folded it, and taped it inside his garage above the workbench. That afternoon, he went to the backhoe, which had sat unmoved for weeks now, and cleaned the windshield with a rag and a bottle of ammonia. He topped off the hydraulic fluid, rotated the tires half a turn to keep them from setting, and checked the ignition. Still live. Still his. He didn't move it, he just made sure it could. That night, he received a call from someone he hadn't spoken to in over a year. An old contact from his transport days, now working as an independent logistics consultant for private construction firms. The man said he'd heard Leo's name come up during a closed-door meeting at a land acquisition briefing. Nothing specific, just that someone had described Leo's property as a pending clearance issue. Not a legal problem, not a lawsuit, just a clearance issue, as if he were a rock to be moved. Leo thanked him, hung up, sat in the dark of his kitchen, fingers drumming against the table. They didn't think of him as a person, not even as an opponent, just friction. And friction, when left untreated, gets filed down. But Leo Harrington wasn't going to be filed down. He was about to get sharper. Leo didn't consider himself a political man. He had no patience for speeches, never voted in local board elections, and only knew his county commissioner's name because it had appeared once on a piece of junk mail offering a senior tax deferment. But politics, in the broadest sense, had now wrapped itself around his property like ivy choking a fence post. He hadn't volunteered for a fight, but they had come onto his land, cut his wires, dropped a machine in his garden, and built a slab of concrete to connect one fraudulent plan to the next. Now, with the legal wheels turning and attention growing sharper, someone in the shadows had decided it was time to escalate. Not with lawsuits, but with pressure. The kind that couldn't be filed, couldn't be notarized, and didn't show up in county records. It started subtly. Leo's email accounts began to glitch. Not full outages, but enough interference that critical updates from Cal's office weren't showing up. He assumed it was server-related until Cal sent a message directly to his backup address, asking why he hadn't responded to a time-sensitive affidavit. Then came the mail disruptions. Envelopes already opened by the time they reached his box, staples pulled, fingerprints smudged from handling. When he contacted the postmaster, they said delays were normal due to staffing shortages. Leo didn't buy it. Next, the contractors he'd worked with for years began canceling jobs or refusing delivery. One supplier, who'd never once missed a scheduled drop, sent a terse email explaining they could no longer service his location due to security risks. When Leo followed up, the manager didn't respond. 3 days later, one of his refrigerated trailers was found tagged in red paint. Zoner. A term no one uses casually, especially not in that part of Nevada. The implication was clear. He was now marked not just as a holdout, but as someone interfering with development, progress, and the hidden money flow that slithered through back-office agreements. And all the while, the backhoe stayed embedded in Mirinda Sloan's living room. She had tried, unsuccessfully, to have it forcibly removed through a court order. But the judge had ruled, for now, that because it had originated on Leo's land and was operated in response to what could be construed as an illegal encroachment, it had to remain in place until all disputes were resolved. Which meant her house, once the symbol of her petty authority, now had an industrial wound at its center, an architectural humiliation that no number of online rants could erase. But humiliation wasn't enough for whoever was pulling the strings. Leo had noticed the drone first on a Sunday morning, hovering low over the northwest corner of his roof. It wasn't one of the usual quadcopters used by realtors. This one was compact, fast and silent until it dipped too low and its hum betrayed it. He followed its path, grabbed a pair of binoculars from the porch and traced it back over the ridge where it vanished beyond the tree line near the old gas easement. The next day, a second drone appeared, this time taking footage directly above the shop where he stored his smaller loaders. When he reviewed his own security feed, he found something worse. 2 frames had been digitally altered. The time code jumped by 12 seconds, then resumed as if nothing had happened. That meant someone hadn't just been watching. They had tapped in. Leo upgraded his system the same day. New encryption, external battery backup, solar redundancy for uplink power, and motion-triggered decoy loops that recorded one layer while streaming another. He wasn't going to play defense forever, but he would make sure that if someone came too close again, they'd leave more than just a camera lens behind. That's when Cal called again, voice tense and clipped. They filed a claim with the state registrar. They're trying to challenge your plat map retroactively. Leo exhaled, slow and controlled. On what basis? Old municipal overlay from the 70s, supposedly uncovered in the archive. A technicality. They're trying to say your property was never properly exempted from shared use zoning, which, if it sticks, gives them jurisdictional argument to install public infrastructure across that corridor. Leo said nothing. Cal continued. They're hoping you blink. The hearing's in 2 weeks. They want you to be buried in prep or force a settlement. But Leo wasn't preparing to blink. He was preparing to strike. That evening, he drove 40 minutes out to a semi-retired land assessor named Vaughn Gillis. Vaughn had worked for both public agencies and private developers. He knew the systems, knew how maps were layered, scanned, digitized, and manipulated, and, more importantly, he hated being lied to. Leo brought him coffee, handed him a flash drive, and explained the entire situation without dramatics. He didn't ask for help. He just laid out the facts. Vaughn stared at the files for 20 minutes, brows furrowing deeper by the minute. This wasn't an accident, he said. Whoever did this used backdoor metadata to bury the overlay under a temporary review flag. It's just enough to make it look official to someone skimming, but it won't hold up to audit. Leo asked how hard it would be to prove. Not hard, Vaughn said, but someone at the county's going to be pissed. Let them be, Leo replied. By the end of the week, they had an affidavit from Vaughn, notarized and appended to the hearing brief. Cal filed a motion to suspend all county overlay actions until the integrity of the parcel data system could be independently verified. That landed like a grenade in the planning office. And it showed. 3 different requests for extensions were filed by Miranda's camp in under 48 hours. Delay, stall, deflect. It meant they were running out of options. But the opposition wasn't finished. One night, around 3 a.m., Leo's dogs began barking in frantic bursts. When he stepped outside, flashlight in one hand and 357 in the other, he found the chain-link gate wide open, its lock cut, and a half-dug trench near the edge of the workshop. Whoever had done it was gone by then, but they left a shovel, a cracked utility pipe, and a plastic stake labeled Fiber Install, Clearance Approved. Leo called it in. Deputies showed up, took photos, and made notes, but as usual, no arrests. No follow-up, just more paperwork that would vanish into a drawer. Cal was furious. They're staging fake infrastructure to justify retroactive construction. It's not just fraud, it's entrapment. Leo agreed. So they went public, but not through the press. They leaked the Vaughn affidavit to a local land rights coalition. No headlines, no TV, just an internal network of property owners who had been watching from the sidelines. It spread fast. Within a week, 4 more cases surfaced. Different neighborhoods, different boards, same methods. Someone had built a playbook around eroding land control through procedural noise. And Leo's case was now the linchpin. If he lost, the others would be next. The tension finally snapped when an envelope arrived taped to his front door. No postage, no name. Just one sheet inside. A map of his property with 3 areas circled in red ink. Below them, 3 words. Next. Your choice. Leo studied the map for a full minute. Then he lit a match and burned it, piece by piece, over the old steel sink behind the shop. He didn't panic, didn't report it, didn't even mention it to Cal. Instead, he walked outside, stood by the backhoe, and stared at the hole it had left in Miranda's house. She had covered the breach with plywood now, but it didn't hide the damage. It never would. He ran his hand along the steel arm and smiled, not out of satisfaction, but clarity. They wanted pressure? Then it was time they learned how much weight this man could carry before something cracked. And it wouldn't be him. The courtroom wasn't large, but it had the weight of consequence that made every sound echo a little too sharply. The overhead lights were yellowed from age, the carpet stained in corners, and the ceiling tiles warped where the old AC vent rattled like a nervous tick. But for all its drab sterility, it was the only place that mattered now. Months of quiet escalation, digital manipulation, legal skirmishes, and unspoken threats had funneled down to this space, a county courtroom with cracked wood panels and an indifferent bailiff leaning against a wall. For Leo, it was less a final stand than a formal interruption. He wasn't looking for victory, he was looking for recognition. He wanted the record to reflect in plain language that what had been done to him wasn't a misunderstanding, or a zoning issue, or a paperwork error. It had been a choice. A deliberate, systemic effort to erase his ownership 1 inch at a time. On the opposite side of the room sat Miranda Sloane in a gray blazer 1 size too tight, her arms folded, expression stiff with manufactured composure. Her attorney, Brennison, wore a purple tie and the kind of confidence that comes from too many seminars. Behind them sat a man Leo hadn't seen before. Slick hair, subtle pinstripe suit, and an expression that said he wasn't there to lose. Cal had already flagged him as a real estate development proxy, probably from the Wyoming shell company that financed the concrete job. No one introduced him. No one needed to. The judge entered. A woman in her 60s with eyes like granite and a voice that didn't rise unless she wanted it to. She didn't waste time on speeches. The hearing was about the validity of Leo's plat map and the legal ramifications of the modified overlay submitted 6 months earlier. Cal laid out their case with brutal clarity, starting with the historical deed trail, moving through surveyor records, and ending with the affidavit from Vaughn Gillis, who sat quietly in the back, flanked by 2 other retired assessors who had agreed to appear as technical witnesses. Then came the metadata audit, line-by-line logs showing that someone had accessed the property system using administrator privileges and inserted the unapproved shared access corridor designation without notification to the landowner. Cal didn't accuse anyone directly. He didn't need to. The data stood on its own, naked and damning. Brennison objected, of course, called the evidence circumstantial, said the metadata could have been corrupted, argued that Vaughn was clearly biased due to prior employment disputes. But the judge didn't flinch. She asked Brennison a single question. Do you have any evidence, any certified documentation, that predates Mr. Harrington's deed and shows a legally recognized access corridor through his property? The silence lasted a beat too long. Brennison stammered about older zoning concepts and implied easements, but the judge waved him down. I'm not interested in implications. I'm interested in documentation. Then she turned to Leo. Do you still have the machine in her home? Leo nodded once. Yes, ma'am. Why? Because they put theirs on mine first. I asked them to remove it. They didn't. And if I order it removed today, I'll drive it back respectfully. She paused, made a note, then continued with her ruling. The overlay was nullified. The modified corridor designation was struck from the parcel record. All future zoning decisions involving the affected area were frozen pending an independent audit of the county's GIS system. The motion to penalize Leo for property damage was denied. So was the restraining order. The court found reasonable cause to view his action as defensive, given the circumstances. Leo didn't smile. He didn't even look at Miranda. He just thanked the judge, shook Cal's hand, and walked out as if he'd been running late for something far less significant. But outside, in the hallway, the man in the pinstripe suit stopped him. No name, no handshake, just a calm voice and a neutral smile. "You've made a lot of people very nervous." Leo didn't stop walking. "They thought you'd take the buyout. They expected someone else, not you." Leo turned slightly. "And who did they expect?" The man shrugged. "Someone with a price." Leo held his gaze for a long moment, then said, "You're going to need new expectations," and walked away. That night, Leo returned to his property, climbed into the backhoe one last time, and eased it slowly back through the wrecked path he'd made weeks earlier. He didn't race. He didn't cut corners. When he reached his side of the boundary, he killed the engine and let the machine rest in the same place it had first been taken from. He didn't need it as a symbol anymore. Now it was just equipment again. The plywood on Miranda's house remained. She hadn't repaired the breach. Maybe she thought it made her look like a victim. Maybe she thought it was a monument to her struggle. Leo didn't care either way. He went inside, took a shower, made a sandwich, and sat at his kitchen table with the dogs asleep nearby. Across the room, taped to the fridge, was the note he'd made months earlier. 3 words in red ink: "Hold your line." He didn't take it down, because the line wasn't just legal, it wasn't just physical, it was him. The weeks that followed moved quietly, but the silence had changed its tone. It was no longer the manufactured hush of people looking away or trying not to get involved. It was the settled quiet of a storm that had passed, leaving behind a different kind of order. Leo noticed the shift in small things. The trucks stopped slowing down in front of his property. The code inspectors didn't come back. His mail arrived sealed, and packages weren't rerouted. The phone calls from unknown numbers tapered off. No more notices left on his gate. No more community announcements slid under his door. Whatever machine had been turning against him had lost its traction, and for now, no one was willing to crank it back to life. Miranda Sloan hadn't been seen publicly since the ruling. Her house, once the hub for her self-appointed civic leadership, now sat mostly dark. The breach where the backhoe had entered was patched with plywood and plastic sheeting, but no real repair crews came. It seemed even the board had begun to step away from her orbit. According to Cal, there had been a closed-door vote to restructure the local advisory group, but the details weren't public. Leo didn't ask for them. It wasn't his concern anymore. What mattered was that the boundary held. The county issued a formal statement acknowledging procedural inconsistencies in their zoning database and began the audit Cal had pushed for. Vaughn was brought in as a third-party reviewer, and within a month several other overlays across the district were rolled back. Leo received a letter of acknowledgement. Sterile, bureaucratic, unsigned at the bottom, but it still felt like a crack in the foundation that had nearly buried him. He didn't frame the letter. He filed it away. He wasn't the type to turn victories into trophies. Instead, he turned his attention back to work. The freight operation had taken a hit during the height of the dispute. Contracts delayed, insurance scrambled, crews uneasy, but things had begun to normalize. Slowly, but steadily. Leo didn't press his people. He showed up more, worked shifts himself, didn't talk about what had happened unless someone asked. Even then, he didn't use big words or paint himself as a hero. He just told it straight. That someone tried to force something that didn't belong to them. That he said no, and that the saying of no cost more than it should have, but less than giving in. On a cold Tuesday morning, just after sunrise, a boy on a bike stopped at the edge of Leo's property where the gravel met the pavement. He didn't approach the house, just stared for a while at the spot where the backhoe used to sit, now replaced by a repacked earth mound and a few hand-laid stones. Leo stepped outside with a cup of coffee and asked if the kid was lost. The boy shook his head. "Did you really drive it through her house?" he asked. Leo didn't smile, didn't confirm or deny. He just sipped his coffee and replied, "I moved what needed moving." The boy nodded like that made perfect sense, turned his bike, and rode off. Later that week, Leo hauled a rusted metal tank out of the lower lot and used the cleared space to build a new tool shed. Modest, cinder-block walls, metal roof, wired by hand. He placed it precisely on the southwest edge of his property, just inside the staked boundary, and mounted a small brass plaque above the door. It read, "This far, no further." He never spoke about the plaque, never pointed it out. But people noticed, and word spread. By spring, 2 of the properties adjacent to his were sold. The buyers were quiet types. One a retired welder, the other a couple from out of state who asked no questions and waved without expectation. It was the kind of neighborliness Leo could live with. He had no desire to be the mayor of anything, but the idea that the boundary had set a tone, that it had sent a message beyond just legal precedent, that felt like enough. Cal called one evening to let him know the development company had formally withdrawn its zoning applications tied to the district. The Shell LLC had dissolved. There would be no master plan, no new concrete, no revised overlay. It was over. Leo thanked him. Then they sat on the line in silence for a few moments before Cal asked, almost as a joke, "You ever think about joining the advisory board now that it's cleaned up?" Leo replied without hesitation, "Not even once." Instead, he stayed where he'd always meant to be, on the edge, not isolated, but unbent. The land was the same, but the way it was seen had changed. He was no longer the man who refused to join. He was the man who had proved why some lines are drawn not to divide, but to protect. And in the quiet that followed, he tended to his lot, his machines, and his dogs. He didn't need headlines or accolades. He had something better: his land.